to one of the world's great scientists about a subject that is going to bowl you over. He has written a book called Science in the Akashic Field. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, speaking to us from Rome, his home is in Rome, is telling us essentially that the legendary Akashic Field is not only real, but he's going to tell us how science is going to become able to access it. This is one of the most amazing books and amazing interviews you will ever hear. Ervin Laszlo is the holder of the highest degree from the Sorbonne, the state doctorate. He's the recipient of 4 honorary PhDs, numerous awards, including the 2001 Goya Award, the Japan Peace Prize. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. He's a former professor of philosophy, system theory, and future studies in the U.S. He is founder of the international think tank, the Club of Budapest, as well as the General Evolution Research Group. He is one of the most prominent scientists in the world. And before we begin, I might say that since we're talking on a long-distance phone line between Los Angeles and Rome, it will not be as easy to hear as the show usually is. But listen up, because Dr. Laszlo is one of the world's great scientists, and he's talking about a totally incredible new discovery.
It's a rediscovery. It's a rediscovery, to my mind, in the newest sciences of a 5,000-year-old concept. This actually comes from the Sanskrit originally, and it meant ether. It meant the underlying field or substance, which was the most fundamental of all things, more fundamental than air or fire or earth. So this Akasha is basically the ultimate reality in Hindu and Indian philosophy. And it's interesting that this Akasha, as the idea of a chronicle, it says that this underlying substance actually records everything that there is. So once something happens, it leaves its traces in the Akasha, and from the Akasha, all other things are being informed by it. And to me, this means a rediscovery of what we are now coming to believe, coming to discover and to find that underlying all the diversity in the world, at the very heart of the cosmos, there is a fundamental field, sometimes called the zero-point field or the quantum field, and that this field actually records and connects everything that happens in space and time.
You make a brief reference in your book to Dr. Hal Puthoff, who is a good friend of mine, and I mentioned your book to him. I think he's eager to read it. I said to him that attempting to extract energy from the 0 point is almost like pricking the skin of God. And I wonder how you react to the idea that this field may in some way be not only a gathering place of the experience, if you will, of the universe, but something in a way perhaps that it's difficult for us to necessarily put into words, alive.
Well, life, I think life is a very relative concept. I think the whole universe is in some sense alive. Everything that develops, everything that grows spontaneously in nature is a kind of a system. When it reaches that level where it grows and evolves so that it has a reference to itself and can reproduce, then we call it life. I don't see why we shouldn't call certain kind of macromolecules or entire galaxies, a developing system, in a way, alive. So I think this fundamental field could be better characterized as, in some sense, the seat of consciousness. Because probably, but this takes us, right away into the deep end, but I'm happy to go there. I think it's our individual consciousness is, in a sense, a fragment or a reflection of a deeper universal cosmic consciousness, which is there in nature, and it is there at the origin of all things. Now, if you ask what is the origin of all things, there is a good physics answer to that. In cosmology, we know it's the 0 point field. All the particles that populate the universe, and we are made up of particles, we are made up of atoms, we are made up of molecules, made up of cells, tissue, etc. So ultimately, we are made up of the particles that emerged out of this quantum vacuum, the 0 point field. And if we have a consciousness, I'm sure that other things that emerged out of it also had it. Not as it developed as a complex organism like we are, but in some sense, some level of consciousness there must be there throughout nature, and I think it must have its origin in the zero-point field.
In the zero-point field. Now, as you quote in the book a cosmologist, Stephen Weinberg, who says, "I believe there is no point that can be discovered by the methods of science. I believe that what we have found so far, an impersonal universe which is not particularly directed toward human beings, is what we are going to continue to find, and that when we find the ultimate laws of nature, they will have a chilling, cold, impersonal quality about them." That is, as you point out, one side of Western thinking about the nature of reality. Tell us a little bit about where its weaknesses lie and what the other side, what is evolving on the other side, which I would say is your side.
Well, on this point, I do not agree with Steve Weinberg, whom I admire very much otherwise. Physicists have a tendency to think in the sense that also Einstein thought like that everything must be given eternally. In a sense, we want to discover the laws of nature, the underlying logic of everything, and that seems to be a mathematical abstraction. But when you think that the whole universe actually evolved from a moment that we can call the Big Bang, or perhaps I believe that the Big Bang was also just a part of a larger process in which many universes succeed one another. But in any case, everything that we know is the product of evolution. If you think that the entire universe evolves, we can ask ourselves, of course, which direction, where to, and what is the sense of it. But clearly, this universe is not cold and impersonal. It's a universe that brings forth complex systems, and it's fabulously tuned to complexity. If you change only a minuscule segment, a billionth part of the value of the electromagnetic radiation, for example, of the gravitational field, we could not have complex systems evolve like are necessary for life. So this universe is not a chance product, and it's not an impersonal product. This universe is somehow predestined, in a sense, to bring forth life. And if life comes about, it also higher and higher forms and levels of mind and consciousness come about. In that sense, in an evolutionary viewpoint, and I've been working, as you perhaps know, for almost 40 years now in general evolution theory, the theory that everything evolves and how are the evolving things connected to one another.
Now, this is, of course, extraordinarily interesting. Are there not experiments involving that type of interconnectedness and using protons, experiments that are actually being carried out in the physical world, where a kind of entanglement is shown between two protons that have been together? Once they're split apart, when one of them is acted upon, the other one moves in the same way. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Originally, this was an experiment suggested by Einstein, together with his colleagues Podolsky and Rosen. It's still known as the EPR experiment, and it shows that once you have a particle, which you can split in two, so the two halves of the particle have originated in the same state. It's called the same quantum state. And no matter how far apart these particles travel, if you make a measurement on one, the other one responds exactly as if that measurement would have been made on it. In other words, it gives you the corresponding values, the complementary values. So the particles, once they have been assumed the same state, they remain connected. Even entire atoms, that's true. Nowadays, last spring, there have been a series of experiments on teleportation, widely reported in the media. I'm sure in your program you have been speaking about it as well.
Oh, yes.
Where you show that you can confine atoms in the same kind of a space, and once you so-called entangle these atoms, bring them together in the same state, you can then separate them. And if you perform a very simple operation, basically on the third atom, bringing in the third atom, and you entangle it with one of these two, then the third atom will interact in turn with the non-connected twin. So you can actually, what is known popularly, beam so states of information about the states of an atom from one to another. So everything in that sense, in the physical world, is intensely and strongly and definitely connected, enduringly connected. The question is that this kind of a connection, this kind of immediate and connection that is above space and time because it's practically instant and it's irrespective of distance, that this kind of connection could also operate not only on the super small scale, but on the scale of life. In fact, it's also being discovered on the cosmological scale. The entire universe is said to be entangled, or to use another word for this, non-local.
Well, it would seem to me that if there is something real about the Big Bang, meaning that the universe at one point was extremely dense, then it would be quite true that it would remain entangled, because at one point everything was the same particle. Is that not true?
There's a problem with this assumption, namely that the universe turns out to be entangled or non-local, or simply, if you like, coherent, over distances that light could not have traveled in the intervening time. You know the speed with which light travels, and we can say light travels the distance of 1 light year. So, some parts of the universe that are more than the 13.7 billion light years apart, years apart that the universe has existed. And nevertheless, these parts of the universe remain connected. So I would agree, yes, all parts of the universe are indeed.
Extraordinary. This is Whitley Strieber, and we'll be getting back
near the Big Bang.
Yeah, we'll be getting back to Ervin Laszlo in just a minute, because we're going to be asking him a question. If the Akashic Field exists, then how do we respond to that as human beings? What do we do? We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back. We're talking to Ervin Laszlo, one of the most prominent scientists on this planet, who is saying, quite frankly, that the Akashic Field, the legendary Akashic Field, actually exists, that it's quite real. And you make in your book, Ervin, an extraordinarily powerful argument in Science in the Akashic Field, an integral theory of everything, that this must be true, and it means so much if it is. But then the question becomes, I looked on the internet at the various different websites and the many places that talk about how to access the Akashic record, and on about all of this. How do we respond to the presence of such a vastly potent organism, if you will, in the universe? What do we do?
Well, we respond like we respond to the internet, only more so. Because this is a kind of an internet. We can be connected. We can get online. On the internet, we need a computer, we need some kind of a mechanical gadget, an electronic gadget to be switched on. With this, we need only our brain. But our brain has to be tuned to sensitivity to this. Now, it seems that so-called primitive people have been using this because they have been in contact with each other, even over distances that were beyond the eye or ear. And they had some form of telepathy among them. It seems that animals have, many experiments have shown that animals can respond telepathically. They know, for example, dogs when the owners are coming home, cats when you want to bring them to the hospital for a test and they disappear, and so on and so forth. And they probably know it's not just by looking, but they sense also. So there is this possibility of spontaneous connection. We have to tune ourselves. How do we do this? We simply allow to suspend the kind of censor that we have in our modern mentality. Our modern mentality tells us that nothing can possibly be true that we didn't see through our eyes, see through our ears, or perceive through our sense organs. If we suspend this belief, this kind of a disbelief, and say, yes, it's possible that we are connected, we enter into a deeper sphere of consciousness. Often when you do meditation, when you engage in deep prayer, when you do, the shamans start doing this, but in biofeedback, it's all kinds of ways it's possible to allow the mind simply to respond to very subtle inputs. And then, of course, we find that we can respond to nature, to each other. Mothers and babies do this automatically, for example. It's very well known that the body of a mother, the organs of a mother, responds to the child. A mother can be away from the child, from a baby, no matter how far away, shopping or whatever in town, and then the baby starts crying for food, wants to be fed. In most cases, and many surveys have been done on this, in most cases, the mother starts to lactate, start to produce milk at that point, without consciously knowing it. And of course, there is such a thing as twin pains. Identical twins are very often tuned closer to each other. But ordinary people, in many, many laboratory experiments, show that ordinary people have the ability to sense each other's presence. Many experiments have shown this, and it's possible that the more you know somebody, the closer your contact. And if it's a close emotional contact, you really like or love somebody, then that connection becomes very real. It's there. The primitives had it, tribes had it, closely related people had it, lovers had it. We could all have it. And it will be extremely important to develop this facility, this sensitivity to each other and to our environment, because then we will not do that kind of a violence to our surroundings. We will not be so indifferent to the fate of other people. So I think it has a very important practical consequences of discovering our connections to each other, and to discover that these connections are not illusion, they actually have a physical basis.
This is what's so important, because the Western mind filters out, I think, even involuntarily, because of the sheer force of expectations coming in from all around us. It filters out the variability that you are talking about. And it is as if we go partially blind by being educated in this culture. And you're saying now that the sciences, the very sciences that have been blinding us, can become now part of this new and very ancient vision, and it's a tremendously exciting idea. I want to diverge just for a moment to ask you a question about something. If you're familiar with a paper that was just published in the British Journal of Interplanetary Science by Hal Puthoff and some colleagues of his, Jim Deardorff, Bernie Haish, and Bruce Maccabee, called Inflation Theory Implications for Extraterrestrial Visitation.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with this paper?
No, I have not seen that. I heard about it, yes.
Okay. Well, you don't need to have seen it. I just was going to refer to it, but I won't very much then if you haven't read it also. Instead, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and that is this. You say in your book that you postulate that there might be as many as 100 million planets in the universe that have evolved intelligent life using a damned strict and rigorous set of assumptions. It might be more, but in any case, many of these must be much, much older than ours. And one would think that they must have evolved the kind of process that you've just been talking about into an exquisitely powerful science of vision and seeing. How do you respond to that, and do you think that they may in some way be aware of us or even interacting with us?
This may be entirely the case. I think Isaac Asimov was quite right when he postulated sort of advanced civilizations in his books about the foundation and so on. But there is a problem, you see. There are two problems, actually. One may be that we may be receiving signals of this kind, but we may need a mindset of consciousness, tuning our brain, perhaps you might say, in a more advanced way, so in order to be able to pick up these signals. They may be there. Or we may be picking them up and we don't recognize them. That's also possible. We may have these subtle intuitions of various kinds coming to us, and we repress it, or we just simply think they're illusion and we forget it. They may come to us in certain kind of dreams. They may come to us in daydreams, in so-called white dreams, in deep meditative states. That's one of the possibilities. The other problem is that no doubt if there are advanced civilizations on other planets, then sooner or later they will have developed a knowledge system of some kind where they recognize that in the universe there is this deeper level of existence. But the question is, if these civilizations have also developed a technology which is an energy manipulating technology and liberating enormous energies, will they have had the wisdom to use these energies in such a way that they do not destroy their environment and therefore themselves? Put in simple terms, how long would such a civilization that is capable of deep wisdom and science, how long would such a civilization survive? A couple of 100 years? A couple of 1,000 years? Will it survive for hundreds of thousands of years? If they don't survive very long, then we would have to be very exactly coordinated with them in space and time to receive messages. Because then if they are too soon, they didn't get there yet. If they are a bit late, a bit in certain cosmological sense, then they would already be extinct. So the question is, how many extant existing civilizations are there that have discovered not only communication through the electromagnetic spectrum, but communication through this cosmic internet, which is there?
Well, this is a fascinating question. I want to read to you, and to you, of course, audience, the first sentences of Dr. Puthoff's and colleagues' paper. And I'd like to go down the road of discussing this a little further. They say, it has recently been argued that anthropic reasoning applied to inflation theory reinforces the prediction that we should find ourselves part of a large galaxy-sized civilization, thus strengthening Fermi's paradox concerning where are they. Furthermore, superstring and membrane theory allow for the possibility of parallel universes, some of which in principle could be habitable. In addition, discussion of such exotic transport concepts as traversable wormholes now appears in the rigorous physics literature. As a result, the we are alone solution to Fermi's paradox, based on the constraints of early 20th century viewpoints, appears today to be inconsistent with new developments in our best current physics and astrophysics theories. In effect, they are saying that somebody is already here and probably has been for the entire expression of human life, or at least, if not actually here, certainly aware of us. And I'm wondering what that may mean. As physics evolves, it becomes clearer and clearer that if anybody else exists, they almost have to be here in some form. How do you react to all of this? How you must be aware of these sorts of ideas. How are you digesting?
Absolutely. I agree with the basic assumption underlying it. So the problem is that in standard super string theories, you assume that there could be a lot of enormous number of separate universes, maybe 10 on the 100th power, or even 500th power. Various physicists, like Susskind, have suggested this. But the usual assumption is that these universes are separate from each other, that they are not connected. Now, if they are not connected, we don't have any information on them. They could exist, but we do not know, nor do they know about us. Now, what Puthoff is saying, and where I fully agree, that either through wormhole, or to my mind, a wormhole is just another expression of saying through this cosmic internet, which are called the Akashic Field, which is really the quantum vacuum, the 0-point field, that through that communication is possible. Because everything that happens, no matter which universe happens, is its traces are present in this fundamental vacuum field. And therefore, these traces are present in a sense everywhere. They are in a distributed form, just like in holograms. So the information in this vacuum is a total information, and holographic information, and it's there everywhere. The trick, you see, the big question is how to read that, how to access that. But I'm sure that if you can access interplanetary information from other civilizations, in principle, it should be possible to access information about other universes which have.
We are going to take a little break right now, and when we get back, we're going to ask Dr. Laszlo Ervin more about just what that process of accessing that information, perhaps that's out there from other civilizations, might be. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back with Dr. Ervin Laszlo, Science in the Akashic Field, an integral theory of everything. Before we left the air, we were beginning to talk about the possibility of accessing information that may be around, that may be present because of the efforts of other, perhaps more advanced civilizations. And of course, that gets me to thoughts of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and Seth Shostak and his friends, and their efforts to find some kind of radio transmission, which I've always suspected was the wrong direction. Now we're beginning to see that photons, for example, that have been entangled, and maybe in the end everything can be used to transmit, in effect, messages faster than light across the whole breadth of the universe without any time involved at all. Using such communications, could we learn how to access perhaps any civilization, whether they are advanced enough to be consciously using such a methodology, or simply there? Could we maybe learn to use the Akashic Field to access everything? And if so, what direction should we go in to start to learn this, Doctor?
See, right now we can start from a matter of principle and then try by reasoning to see what is possible. Just like we start from principle of the idea of non-locality and teleportation, and within a matter of years we'll be developing quantum computers based on it. So the first thing is to find out whether such a thing is in principle possible. Now, in my theory, which is what we modestly call the theory of everything, an integral theory, because it includes life and consciousness, not only physics. I say that everything that exists in the universe and everything that exists in space and time has a basis in the particles. And these particles have various properties, including a magnetic momentum. These magnetic momentums are similar to what happens when you put information on a computer disk. So in the magnetic momentum in space, if space is filled, as we are now convinced that space is filled with the subtle energies, this magnetic momentum registers. It registers in the form of the spin of the particles. So everything, in a way, is there, is registered. These various spins, these various torsion waves, actually, that travel through this underlying field, which is the vacuum field. Vacuum, by the way, is a completely misleading term. It's a plenum. It's a fullness, not an emptiness. Nevertheless, it's been called like that, and we probably stay with that, calling it a vacuum, but we know that it's a fullness. And everything that happens in that field, therefore, creates waves. These waves intersect, and the intersecting waves carry information. Just like in a hologram, you have two beams of light intersecting, and that intersection produces a complex pattern, and that carries information on the surface of the object, that you use to photograph holographically. So information is there. The principle is simple. Whatever has happened once, no matter how large or small, no matter where, is in some sense continues to be present. Its traces are there. Its holographic traces are there. And these holographic traces do not disappear. There is nothing that we could think of in this quantum vacuum, in the zero-point field, that would cancel information. We know that these kind of particular waves, they do not simply destroy each other. They superpose. In other words, they create a more complex, multidimensional pattern, and this pattern, of course, continues to exists and continues to carry the information. So, in principle, we can say, no matter where, no matter what, no matter how large, how small, the information is there in the field. The question is to read out this information, to gather this information, to have the technique or the technology to access this information.
Well, of course, that's the ace question: the technique or the technology. The mystics, or I wouldn't say that's the wrong word. The ancients would say that it's technique, that it is meditation, that it is in effect, if you visualize or conceive of the body's electrical field as an organ in and of itself, then it's quite possible that the tiny part of it, micromillimeters deep, that exists on the surface of the body, once the body is in a meditative state, it goes in effect into superposition and plugs you into the entire universe. And it may be that a disciplined approach to this, with an understanding of what is happening, could enrich this communication tremendously. How do you react to an idea like that?
You see, Whitney, the first thing I would say is that the first thing to do is to recognize that we are dealing with some aspect of reality in the same sense as a particle is real, the same sense as a galaxy is real. We are dealing with something that is not an illusion. We're dealing with something that belongs as a fundamental aspect of this physical universe, this evolving universe. If we do that, I think, and if you recognize that there is this connecting field, this what I call the A field, because we talk about the G field as the gravitational field, the EM field, the electromagnetic field. So why not call this subtle interconnecting field that registers all things and conveys the information? Why not name it after the Akashic record, the A field? So once we recognize that this is reality, this is part of the real world, then we can go back. No doubt there will be many projects, many serious research is undertaken to, first of all, examine how did the ancients do this? How did the so-called simple or traditional people, like the Aborigines in Australia, who seem to be entering it, very apropos to the title of your program, because they talked about dream time, for example.
Yes.
They talk about that's where they access the information about cosmos and about each other in dream time. So primitives do this. In altered states of consciousness, we do this. Psychotherapists can induce such kind of states. So many ways exist of tapping into this. We have to take it seriously so that there will be serious research programs dedicated to this particular end.
But of course, the difficulty becomes the one that people, again, I keep mentioning Hal Puthoff. For some reason, he's coming up in this conversation, at least for me, a lot. When he was doing his remote viewing, he started the remote viewing program here at the Stanford Research Institute. Their problem was replicability. In other words, how can one be objective enough about these very indistinct sorts of things? You know, one remote viewer might really see something extraordinary, and another remote viewer might see something very different and equally extraordinary, but it's not verifiable at this level. Do you foresee any potential for verification at a scientific level of acceptability in terms of scientific method as coming about in areas which now bleed into what we call the paranormal?
It comes through brain research. There is a very simple technique of registering the electric waves produced by the wave, the EEG, the electroencephalograph. Now, many experiments have been made, and I've been participating in some of them, in which you can show that people who are in no sensory contact whatsoever, they don't hear, see, or smell each other in any way, that rooms could be separate buildings, then they enter into meditative space, they enter into communication with each other. First of all, their right and left hemispheres become synchronized, then the synchronization extends to different people. I've seen some experiments with 12 people that are connected to a computer, but they're not in any sensory contact, and spontaneously, as they enter deeper and deeper into meditative states, their brain printouts show a fantastic up to 98% synchronization. Then you have also, in addition to this, you have the transfer stimuli. You can stimuli one of the subjects, you can give or a sudden sound or a sudden stroboscopic light, and the brains, of course, of this subject, then they register it in terms of the EEG pattern. They'll register the results of the brain picking up this information. But now, another person who is not subjected to this stimuli would not normally register such this particular pattern. But when people know each other, the closer they know each other, the closer they are related, also physically or emotionally, the more it works. The other person also picks it up, and after a while, they seems to demonstrate exactly the same pattern as the stimulated subject. So talk about verification. When you do the kind of things, like how Putra was doing with remote viewing experiments, interpretation comes in, and interpretation is always a touchy thing. We have to deal with it. But obviously it's already something, but a matter of opinion comes in. When you deal with the printout of an EEG pattern, then if the machine does it, you simply look at it and you compare it. And you see either is a similarity, either there is a transfer of this information, or there isn't. And very often you see it. You see it with people who are doing remote healing, for example. A healer acts on one subject. I recount experiences like this in my book. And then he leaves sort of the patient. Elsewhere picks it up, and the brain registers the same kind of pattern. So to show that this actually occurs, you can start with the very simple question or matter of the electric pattern produced by the brain. And that is non-questionable. That is non-disputable.
This is Whitley Strieber. In a few moments, we will be back with Ervin Laszlo. We're going to be talking about some remarkable material in his book regarding creationism. But before we get to that, we're going to discuss just a little bit further why it is that the ancients knew so much about this, if they were indeed as primitive as we have assumed them to have been. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back with Ervin Laszlo, one of the great scientists of this world, who has written a powerful book, Science and the Akashic Field, an integral theory of everything. Dr. Laszlo, when we were talking last, I was so reminded of John Donne's, I believe it's his 17th meditation, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. As if a clod is washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as I recall him saying. And then my recollection dissipates, I'm sorry to say, along with the clod. But the point is this. Recognizing this as a physical reality seems to be a tremendously empowering point in human history. Has it happened before? Because when you look into the past, into the traditions of meditation within yoga, for example, it begins to become clear that what we are seeing are extremely sophisticated methods of doing just what we've been discussing, of objectively accessing the Akashic Field. How did they know?
I think it's much more natural to know than to not to know. It's not natural to repress this knowledge. But this also has precedents. You see, these precedents have come about in the development of Western science, Western civilization. We tend to think that what we think here in the West, what we have thought here for the past couple of 100 years, is really human nature. But it isn't so. When you think of other civilizations, they work under quite different suppositions. They have quite different concepts. Here, our Western way of thinking has been very decisively influenced by the experiments carried out first by Galileo, and then by Newton and Copernicus and Kepler and so on. To keep in mind that these experiments were the first experiments in what we call modern science. and they dealt with matters that are manifest. Manifest is coming from the Latin of manus, hand, and something that's coming to hand, something that you can grasp. Galileo, as you know, dropped different kind of balls from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He rolled them down inclined planes. He measured the speed, etc.
Right.
And Newton systematized these. He made them into universal laws of motion. Now, all these are things that we can measure. Now, things that we can measure, apparently could measure over 300 years ago, were relatively mechanical things, macroscopic things, not the very small, also not the very large. But these could be measured. Also, then, the movement of the planets around the sun could be measured. So the supposition then followed, very naturally, even though it was false. The supposition was, whatever we can measure is real. Whatever we cannot measure is not real, just illusion. Now, what we can measure depends on our instruments. But this proviso wasn't put there. It depends on instrument. We just thought whatever could be measured by those instruments that date back now a couple of hundred years must be the nature of reality. So effectively, everything that could not be measured by physical instruments was considered to be illusion. Now, this physical instrument became more and more powerful. And in the late 70s and 1980s, for the first time, as we said a little while back in our conversation, we could measure how particles are connected to each other, even though they are distant from one another. This was not possible before. So now our instruments are taking us to the point where we discover that we thought to be this rather sterile reality isn't all of reality. There are many more things. There are many more subtle things. There are many more connections. There are many more nuances in this world. And this naturally was known because some of these nuances, some of these aspects are accessible to the human mind. Only we mustn't repress it. We mustn't filter them out. It was natural in other civilizations to feel that you have a sense of solidarity, a feeling for somebody else, that you actually feel such a person. Lovers today still, they don't worry about science, and they say, yes, I have a sense of oneness. I can feel what my partner is feeling. And primitives knew this. Psychologists are beginning to discover it also. Just you both it done. Let me just remind you for a moment about a beautiful saying by William James. James said over 100 years ago that we are like islands in the sea. And at first sight, you would think that means we're separate. But no, he continued saying we are separate in the surface.
Yes.
We seem to be separate, but in the deep we are connected.
Yes, Doctor, you just dropped out again because of something in the telephone system. And I'll just repeat what Doctor. Why don't you repeat? He said that we are separate on the surface, but beneath the surface, we are all connected. That is correct, isn't it?
This is the insight. William James said this, and I think everybody, because he has studied what we call the religious experience, and everybody who studied meditation, who studied the states of deep prayer or artistic trance or inspiration or whatever, in other words, non-ordinary states of consciousness, which are not typical of the waking consciousness of modern Western person. Anybody who studied these other states of consciousness knows that, yes, we have a sense for each other. We have a sense of connectedness to nature and to each other, and probably up to the cosmos. A psychiatrist like Stanislav Grof, for example, has made thousands of experiments, has records of thousands of patients who actually describe the connections they sense as they enter this slightly altered state of consciousness. So it's there. It's there practically for everybody. We must simply allow it to happen.
Now, when you speak of consciousness, you have a very fascinating take on it in the book, in the chapter "Consciousness, Human and Cosmic," and I want to ask you, just to start. I think the question that is the most appropriate one in this area to begin with is simply this: is consciousness a byproduct of the evolution of the brain, or is it something else, Ervin?
Well, I dispute this notion that consciousness is a kind of something that the brain produces, sort of an epiphenomenon, something that it secretes, almost like a gland secretes some kind of fluid. The brain secretes consciousness. I don't believe it's true because first of all, there is now increasing evidence that there are cases in clinical evidence for this when the brain printout goes, the record goes flat. The EEG record becomes flat. There is no brain activity. And subsequently, if the patient comes back, and it's very often there is possible to resuscitate, when the patient comes back, in a large number of cases, almost a fourth or a third of the number of patients that have this experience, they recall conscious experiences. They can recall what has happened during that time. So one trend of the experience shows that it's possible to have consciousness even in the absence of brain function. Another strand of evidence, of course, shows that there is no way that we could say that at a given level of brain complexity, consciousness appears, and below there isn't any. Who are we to say, for example, that my dog or your dog or cat is not conscious? Who are we to say that the birds are not conscious? We can go back down, all the way down to plants, to cells, down to molecules, down to particles. There have been very reputed quantum physicists, like Freeman Dyson, for example, said that probably every electron is conscious. Whitehead, the great philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, said that, all aspects of nature, all what he called actual entities, have both a matter aspect and a mind aspect. So I would say that there is no good assumption, no good way we could draw the line. I say here is consciousness, there isn't. All the systems that arise and evolve in nature have derived their materiality from the quantum vacuum. And they also derive what I call the subjectivity or the interiority from the quantum vacuum, which must have been not only the seat of all matter, but also the seat of all consciousness.
Dr. Ervin Laszlo, Science and the Akashic Field, an Integral Theory of Everything. Nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize, holder of the highest degree of the Sorbonne, an extraordinary man, founder of the Club of Budapest, now taking science beyond the edge of, or beyond the limits of materialism and into a much, much greater world. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Laszlo. It has been a truly inspiring experience to listen to you. And folks, I must recommend his book. It is as inspiring as his words and as empowering. Thank you so much, Dr. Laszlo.
Well, thank you. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
One reporter who... I'll adjust my sound just a second. One reporter who loves mysteries is radio's leading science journalist, Linda Moulton Howe. She's an Emmy Award-winning TV producer, documentary filmmaker, and writer, and the reporter and editor for EarthFiles.com, the Internet's most respected edge science website. Today she's got two reports for us, one on that mega sunspot that blew off last week, and the other on this extraordinary new paper by a group of scientists in the prestigious Journal of the British Interplanetary Society about none other than the probability that ET is already here. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. It was last Saturday, January 15th, that the sun erupted with 3 strong solar flares. And the next day, the sun erupted again. The Space Weather Office at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Boulder, Colorado, released warnings about intense radiation storms that could damage satellites and interrupt radio communications. By Monday, January 17th, the sun erupted yet again with a strong solar flare, and some of the brightest auroras in years were being photographed over the northern latitudes. The next day, there was yet another strong solar flare, totaling 6 major eruptions in only 4 days. Then, on Wednesday, January 20th, the sun let loose with a powerful X7 class solar flare, the strongest radiation storm since October of 1989. The high-energy proton release was greater than 100 megavolts, something like 1 million megatons of TNT. Where were these 7 intense solar flares coming from? A region on the sun called 720 that grew in size rapidly from a small spot to a massive cluster of sunspots as big as 10 Earths in only a few days. That's only happened half a dozen times in the last 130 years of solar monitoring. How could this happen if the sun is supposed to be near solar minimum? That means it's supposed to be near the quietest sunspot time in its regular 11-year cycle of decreasing and increasing sunspot activity. In fact, by the end of this year, the sun should be its calmest before sunspots begin increasing for the next solar maximum, expected to peak in 2010 to 2012. Yet our sun has continued to erupt with strong X-solar flares since that major severe category outbreak at Halloween time in 2003. This week, I talked with David Hathaway. He is Solar Physics Group Leader at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. I asked Dr. Hathaway about our surprisingly energetic sun and the recent and gigantic Region 720, which has now deteriorated but leaves the haunting question: why is our sun still so active?
The surprising thing with this one was how rapidly it grew in size. Very quickly, within a day becoming the size of the Earth, and 2 days twice that big again. And most rapidly growing spots like that, we've only seen a few in the last 130 years that have grown as fast as this one. But most that grow this fast end up producing a lot of what we call solar activity, flares, these huge explosions on the surface of the sun that release the energy equivalent of 1 million megatons of TNT in a matter of seconds, and blow off material from the sun in the form of what we call a coronal mass ejection. These are clouds of material, 1 billion tons of matter that are streamed through the solar system at about 1 million miles an hour. When that cloud of material hits the Earth, it can shake our magnetic field and shower our polar regions with particles that produce things like the aurora borealis.
What's the current hypothesis about what would cause this storm on the sun to come and so rapidly become so large, 10 Earth sizes in a matter of a few days?
Well, we're pretty sure that we know that magnetic fields are what make sunspots, very intense magnetic fields, thousands of times stronger than the Earth's field. And we're quite sure that those magnetic fields are produced deep within the sun, where they're stretched out by fluid flows within the sun. When they get strong enough, they become buoyant. They basically push aside the surrounding gases and are lighter, and so they rise to the surface. And the stronger the fields are, the faster they rise, and the bigger the sunspots they make. And so apparently this one was, again, one that had been building for a while, and once it let loose from deep inside the sun, rapidly came through the surface and again grew at a pretty phenomenal rate over the course of just a few days.
And if this year, let's say in 2005, a year before we're supposed to get to the bottom of the solar minimum before it starts increasing again, if there is another event like the 720 sunspot complex, would that be unusual enough for solar physicists to say, what is going on with the sun, since some people think it is more active than it should be?
Certainly, if we have another outburst like this, we'll have to look closely as to our understanding of how it happens and why it should happen repeatedly like this so late in this solar cycle.
Do you yourself think that there are any anomalies about the sun's activities now? Some people say that there has been more energy released, and others argue no, less. It's as if there's a completely confusing picture about exactly what the relationship is now between the sun's energy, the Earth, and so forth.
Certainly, there's a fair amount of controversy as to the total output from the sun, how bright it is when you add it up over all its different colors, and how that affects our climate here on Earth. I think there's very good evidence that solar activity does influence Earth's climate, but not at the level that would explain the recent warming in the last 50 years or something like that. But something that would contribute to it. There have been recent studies that have looked at radioisotopes in ice that are produced by cosmic rays in the Earth's atmosphere, and the sun modulates the cosmic rays that come in. So we can basically look at solar activity going back for several thousand years now, and it does look like the sun's been more active in the last 50 than it has for a long time. One estimate was that it hasn't had this long a time period of high activity in something like 8,000 years.
With that context, do you, as a person who studies the sun and solar physics, have any expectation for what might happen in this next solar maximum?
Certainly there's controversy there. I have colleagues that think that the next maximum is going to be much smaller than this one. The indications that we've looked at suggest that it ought to be at least the size of this one, if not somewhat larger. There have also been periods in the sun's history where it's been dormant, where it hasn't produced sunspots for many decades, so the sunspot cycle basically stops. Some of my colleagues are even suggesting that we may be headed for one of those. It's called a grand minimum, where, again, there are few sunspots. The last big one was from mid-1600s to the early 1700s, where the sun went for 70 years with hardly any sunspots at all.
And that was associated with the Little Ice Age, right?
That's right.
Well, why would there be a prediction of no sunspots possible when there seems to be increasing activity on the sun, and that your projection that it might be an even more active solar maximum would intuitively seem more correct? And if it were, what would the consequences be for space weather, satellites, and so forth?
Well, again, the various predictions are based on different measurements of the sun, different ways of looking at the sun, and different information, and different pieces of information give a different story. And what we've looked at is how fast the flows are on the surface of the sun, and when we look back over the last 130 years and see how the speed of those flows are related to solar activity, we found that when it's fast, you tend to get a fast, or when it's fast, you tend to get a large cycle, and somewhat into the future, one or two cycles into the future. And what we found was that the cycle before last, the flow was very fast, which should have built up strong magnetic fields near the poles that would have got dragged down into the sun and should produce a large cycle for the next cycle.
If Dr. Hathaway and his colleagues are not right about the next solar maximum being intense yet again, and the sun went the opposite direction and produced very few, if any, sunspots, would the Earth go into another little ice age, as it did during the last grand minimum more than 300 years ago at the end of the 1600s? Whatever the answer is, we'll all know in another 2 or 3 years when the sun should be cycling back to solar maximum. And while we wait and wonder what our sun might do next, 4 PhD scientists have been wondering about other intelligent life in our galaxy and universe. And they have had the courage to publish their thoughts in the January 2005 issue of the mainstream scientific journal of the British Interplanetary Society. The 4 PhD scientists are James Deardorff, Professor Emeritus and meteorologist retired from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Bernard Haish, former director of the California Institute for Physics and Astrophysics in Palo Alto, California. Bruce Maccabee, research physicist for the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren, Virginia. And Hal Puthoff, a pioneer in the physics of zero-point energy research and director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, Texas. Their journal article is entitled, quote, Inflation Theory Implications for Extraterrestrial Visitation, unquote. Inflation theory has replaced Big Bang as the latest general term for models of the very early universe, which involve extremely rapid expansion from something maybe the size of a grapefruit to the entire observable cosmos in only the fraction of a second. Inflation is quantum superstring theory that postulates there are at least 11 dimensions. And in addition, quantum physicists seriously discuss faster than light travel now that could use small black holes called wormholes to make shortcuts through space and time. Another approach to faster than light travel would not move the traveler, but would stretch and bend space-time around the traveler. That is known as the Alcubierre warp drive. If human physicists today are contemplating faster than light travel in our ever-inflating universe, why couldn't there be other older intelligences out there which have already solved the problems of jumping around great distances in and around galaxies? Finally, could the UFO phenomenon be evidence of such advanced technologies visiting Earth? The journal article begins with a discussion of what is called the Fermi paradox. This week I talked with meteorologist Jim Deardorff, who originally began the paper and asked the other three to join him in the goal of getting this taboo subject of researching extraterrestrial visitation published in a mainstream scientific journal. First, I asked Dr. Deardorff to explain the Fermi paradox.
Enrico Fermi is a pretty well-known physicist. He's no longer alive, but back in the 1940s, he was one of the first, I guess it was about 1950 perhaps, that he was first to sort of open up the idea of extraterrestrials perhaps being around in the galaxy. Over lunch one day at Los Alamos, he discussed with his colleagues this problem of since they could be so far advanced over us, why don't we see them? Why aren't they around? And this made the whole topic a little bit more respectable for other scientists to start debating, which they did, and pretty soon some papers came out talking about how it would only take a few million years probably if one extraterrestrial race were even only a few centuries ahead of us in their technology, for them to start exploring from their planet and go to other stellar systems, even if they could only travel at 5 or 10% of the speed of light, and when they found a habitable planet, to colonize it or to exploit it. And then after maybe giving them 1,000 years or more to settle around on that planet, the idea is that they would go out and explore the next star from them outwards, and eventually the whole galaxy should be colonized by the ETs. It would be not all that far ahead of us. And the whole process would only take, they figured, about 10 to 20 million years if you go ahead and calculate that out.
How did the emergence of the inflation theory in the 1980s change or impact the discussions that the Fermi paradox had provoked?
I think it was basically a more recent paper, actually. A paper came out just a year ago by Ken Olam of Tufts University in the Department of Astronomy. He's an astrophysicist. And he suggested that really Fermi's paradox is stronger than you would think. I mean, the question of why aren't they here is even worse than Fermi proposed, because in a galaxy or in a universe that's underwent inflation, which we think most astrophysicists think our universe did go through a phase, very, very early phase of terrific expansion, that the universe is practically infinite in size, and there should be just so many chances of other ETs around it. We should find ourselves immersed in galactic civilizations all over the place, and so again, really, why aren't they around?
Now, what provoked you and Bernie Haish and Bruce Maccabee and Hal Puthoff to produce this very interesting paper, Inflation Theory Implications for Extraterrestrial Visitation?
Well, that's a nice question, because those, like myself, scientists who have looked into the UFO phenomenon over the years, we realized how tough it is to get any good paper into scientific journals telling about what's really been going on with the UFO phenomenon, into journals that mainstream scientists typically read. And that's because most journal editors in science journals just haven't been even considering any papers that they receive involving the UFO topic, haven't considered them even worthwhile to send out to review. But then I felt that, well, every few years, 5 or 10 or 20 years, we really ought to keep testing the journal articles and find maybe attitudes are changing a little bit, or more reasonable or slightly more open-minded journal editors might have come to the fore. And so we shouldn't just give up because the curtain of ridicule against the UFO phenomenon has been so strong over the years. So we decided we would give it another try, even though all the authors, including myself, realized we had scarcely any chance of getting the paper into the most prominent science journals, which in the U.S. is one called Science, and in Britain it's the one called Nature. And we did indeed submit our paper to those two journals first, just to test them out, and they wouldn't even send them out to review. If they had sent them out to review, it's quite likely they would have found some good reviewers. But in this business, everything depends upon who a journal editor wants to send a paper out to for review. So I think fear of ridicule is a big thing. We want to help science overcome that so that the subject can be discussed seriously in the scientific literature.
And so what happened? Where did you get published, and how did that occur?
Yeah, well, Hal Puthoff, our one of the co-authors, has been publishing quite a few of his theoretical papers in physics in the last few years in this journal called the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, JBIS. And so he suggested we try that journal next. And so we did. I once published an article in it myself, and I knew that they're more open-minded than some of the other journals. Although it just has a small readership, it's for the more narrow topic of people who are interested in space travel and what's the best way to do it. So we gave that a try, and we were fortunate that we had a responsible, rather open-minded editor, I think, in that journal.
In your paper, in section 6, it says inferring an ET strategy. Could you explain that more? Well,
there have been quite a few papers in the past, scientific papers, inferring a UFO strategy of why don't we see them around in trying to explain Fermi's paradox. And so we sort of build on that. And in science, you have to really, if you propose anything new, you have to first say, well, what's wrong with the accepted conclusions of the past, and then go on to give your new proposals or theories. And there had been proposals that the solar system and the Earth were perhaps a wildlife preserve or a zoo for extraterrestrials to keep any proposals in the scientific literature that ETs could be having a hands-off attitude towards Earth because we're just not prepared for them. There's a laboratory hypothesis that we're sort of a laboratory for ETs to observe. If they observe us covertly without us knowing about it, and they can see how we develop without having open interference by the ETs themselves. And the embargo theory that they're having hands-off because it would be just too traumatic if ETs were to suddenly have open contact with us. Maybe governments would topple and stock market would collapse and all that. So earlier there had been my own paper mentioning how, well, some of these theories lack one thing, that if the ETs had a total hands-off attitude towards Earth, then someday we would nevertheless run into them, and then the culture shock would be so great as we think it would have been even 30 years ago, so that you would still have governments collapsing and civilization might come to a halt. So I propose that there was a leak in the embargo against Earth, and this leak takes various forms, but in this paper I didn't talk about the UFO phenomenon because if I'd used the word UFO, I felt that the paper would have been rejected. Mm-hmm. Probably was the case. So we go on here to say how it looks like they're remaining covert for the reason of not shocking society into any abrupt knowledge of their presence, but just presenting themselves to selected witnesses here and there over a very long time scale ever since World War II.
And that would explain the Fermi paradox about if the universe was filled with life, why aren't they here?
Yes, exactly. There's just no excuse for other scientists who are wondering why ETs aren't here not to include the UFO phenomenon in their analysis.
Dr. Deardorff said that they have had congratulatory emails from other scientists in various parts of the world, glad to see this paper in a mainstream science journal. And Dr. Deardorff told me that he personally expects there to be some kind of open extraterrestrial contact on Earth within the next 20 years, perhaps provoked by humanity's persistent destruction of the planet's land, sea, and air. And he thinks that to the ETs, or at least to something out there, the whole planet's biodiversity might be more important than the survival of any one species.
Which suggests that perhaps they may wait to contact us until after we've died back a bit and learned our lesson. Do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, he made a very interesting comment. He said that he senses that over the next very few years, and I've just talked about the action on the sun that seems to be more energetic and may go another direction, depending upon whichever direction the sun goes. We have global warming, and all scientists saying that the next 10, 15, 20 years might be rough for this planet. And Dr. Deardorff said, perhaps an intelligence that knows it would shock us if it simply shows up might actually wait for a time when the trauma is so great that its arrival would not shock, but might be perceived even as a help.
Well, I think something like that might very well happen, because there's no question in my mind they are here, and they are hanging back, and they are very, very careful to keep themselves secret, hidden. They go far enough to where we are getting used to the idea that they may be present, but not so far that we become certain of it and therefore redirect the focus of our whole culture onto them. They will, though, I think, if things begin to fall apart so badly that the species, or maybe the whole planet, is liable to go extinct. And I don't think that in that context they're going to be particularly pleasant to us. I have to tell you that, the ones I've met, some of them have been very extraordinary, but also tough, real tough. And others have, as you know, and as we have both observed, done things that do not suggest, like they do in their very hopeful paper, that this is really something from a kind of a higher level, and that a galactic civilization would necessarily be more ethical than us. I corresponded with Dr. Puthoff about this, and he said that some of the writers of the paper are hopeful that a quote-unquote higher civilization would also have a higher ethical position. However, I would think that having more technology does not necessarily mean that. It certainly didn't for the Spaniards and the Mesoamerican Indians and the Incas.
Well, I think it's safe to say that there appears to be possibly mixed agendas from more than one intelligence. And the thing that amazes me as a reporter who has lived from the 20th to the 21st century is that if we do survive this century and humans are looking back, that maybe they will be astonished that governments were able, literally, to bend truth upside down and keep the presence of other intelligent life in the universe completely away from all of humanity on this planet for decades. That is actually astonishing.
Well, Linda, thank you for a very provocative report, and we'll see if his prediction holds true. I have a feeling it will. I think that they are very close to open contact at this point, and we'll be talking again with Linda Moulton Howe next week, where its weaknesses lie and what the other side, what is evolving on the other side, which I would say is your side.
Well, on this point, I do not agree with Steve Weinberg, whom I admire very much otherwise. Physicists have a tendency to think in the sense that also Einstein thought like that everything must be given eternally. In a sense, we want to discover the laws of nature, the underlying logic of everything, and that seems to be a mathematical abstraction. But when you think that the whole universe actually evolved from a moment that we can call the Big Bang, or perhaps I believe that the Big Bang was also just a part of a larger process in which many universes succeed one another. But in any case, everything that we know is the product of evolution. If you think that the entire universe evolves, we can ask ourselves, of course, which direction, where to, and what is the sense of it. But clearly, this universe is not cold and impersonal. It's a universe that brings forth complex systems, and it's fabulously tuned to complexity. If you change only a minuscule segment, a billionth part of the value of the electromagnetic radiation, for example, of the gravitational field, we could not have complex systems evolve like are necessary for life. So this universe is answer to that. In cosmology, we know it's the zero-point field. All the particles that populate the universe, and we are made up of particles, we are made up of atoms, we are made up of molecules, made up of cells, tissue, etc. So ultimately, we are made up of the particles that emerged out of this quantum vacuum, the zero-point field. And if we have a consciousness, I'm sure that other things that emerge out of it also have it, not as it developed as a complex organism like we are. But in some sense, some level of consciousness there must be there throughout nature, and I think it must have its origin in the zero-point field.
In the zero-point field. Now, as you quote in the book a cosmologist, Stephen Weinberg, who says, "I believe there is no point that can be discovered by the methods of science. I believe that what we have found so far, an impersonal universe which is not particularly directed toward human beings, is what we are going to continue to find, and that when we find the ultimate laws of nature, they will have a chilling, cold, impersonal quality about them." That is, as you point out, one side of Western thinking about the nature of reality. Tell us a little bit about
a 5,000-year-old concept. This actually comes from the Sanskrit originally, and it meant ether. It meant the underlying field or substance, which was the most fundamental of all things, more fundamental than air or fire or earth. So this Akasha is basically the ultimate reality in Hindu and Indian philosophy. And it's interesting that this Akasha, as the idea of a chronicle, it says that this underlying substance actually records everything that there is. So once something happens, it leaves its traces in the Akasha, and from the Akasha, all other things are being informed by it. And to me, this means a rediscovery of what we are now coming to believe, coming to discover and to find that underlying all the diversity in the world, at the very heart of the cosmos, there is a fundamental field, sometimes called the zero-point field or the quantum field, and that this field actually records and connects everything that happens in space and time.
You make a brief reference in your book to Dr. Hal Puthoff, who is a good friend of mine, and I mentioned your book to him. I think he's eager to read it. I said to him that attempting to extract energy from the 0 point is almost like pricking the skin of God. And I wonder how you react to the idea that this field may in some way be not only a gathering place of the experience, if you will, of the universe, but something in a way perhaps that it's difficult for us to necessarily put into words, alive.
Well, life, I think life is a very relative concept. I think the whole universe is in some sense alive. Everything that develops, everything that grows spontaneously in nature is a kind of a system. When it reaches that level where it grows and evolves so that it has a reference to itself and can reproduce, then we call it life. I don't see why we shouldn't call certain kind of macromolecules or entire galaxies, a developing system, in a way, alive. So I think this fundamental field could be better characterized as, in some sense, the seat of consciousness. Because probably, but this takes us, right away into the off the deep end, but I'm happy to go there. I think it's our individual consciousness is, in a sense, a fragment or a reflection of a deeper universal cosmic consciousness, which is there in nature, and it is there at the origin of all things. Now, if you ask what is the origin of all things, there is a good physics.
To one of the world's great scientists about a subject that is going to bowl you over. He has written a book called Science in the Akashic Field. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, speaking to us from Rome, his home is in Rome, is telling us essentially that the legendary Akashic Field is not only real, but he's going to tell us how science is going to become able to access it. This is one of the most amazing books and amazing interviews you will ever hear. Ervin Laszlo is the holder of the highest degree from the Sorbonne, the state doctorate. He's the recipient of 4 honorary PhDs, numerous awards, including the 2001 Goya Award, the Japan Peace Prize. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. He's a former professor of philosophy, system theory, and future studies in the U.S. He is founder of the international think tank, the Club of Budapest, as well as the General Evolution Research Group. He is one of the most prominent scientists in the world. And before we begin, I might say that since we're talking on a long-distance phone line between Los Angeles and Rome, it will not be as easy to hear as the show usually is. But listen up, because Dr. Laszlo is one of the world's great scientists, and he's talking about a totally incredible new discovery.
It's a rediscovery. It's a rediscovery, to my mind, in the newest sciences